watching Keeping It Green. I'm your host, Debbie Klughers, and today I have with me Mr. James Grimes, the owner of Four Pond Native Plants out in Montauk, New York.
Yep, thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming out, James. Jim?
Jim, doesn't matter.
Okay, and we're going to talk about native plants and going native and being green and all kinds of great things, and you're the man for the job, so.
Well, we've been in business since about 1978. My original background was I was going to be Jacques Cousteau. I was going to be a marine biologist, and I worked in a lab for a few years and just found that I really liked plants. So we started doing the native thing probably 10 years or so before it became popular.
Okay.
We were the guys that were trying to sell you weeds to plant in your yard, and that was the way some of these plants were received at that time. And now as time has gone on, they're popular, and they do a very good job of not just looking good. You know, the style of work that we do mostly is we try and do sort of an interactive landscape. It's not just something that you look at. We try and pick plants that either produce berries, fruit that can be eaten, which may not be eaten by the homeowner. It may be, you know, these little plants like this is low bush blueberry here. Gets a really nice little white flower.
Very pretty.
Gets great tasting fruit in the middle of the summer. Baltimore Orioles love it.
Wow, nice.
So it's one of those plants, even if you don't get to eat the plant, somebody's enjoying it.
That's great. And that's important, you know, with us taking over so much open space and land, that if we plant things for the wildlife.
Well,
you know,
and also what some of these plants are, and I think probably the biggest reason to use some of our natives is the input that you're putting into getting this plant to survive, which kind of leads into basic horticulture. One of the biggest problems I have, you know, selling native plants and specializing in that is this sort of the misconception that it's native. It'll grow anywhere. I can grow this plant on asphalt if I wanted to.
It's the proper growing conditions.
There's so many, you know, there's different environments out here. There's sandy, dry soils, there's sandy, wet soils, there's heavy clay soils, there's a variety of things, and much like any other plant, you have to take that into consideration. So the first thing I always tell people is, you know, look at I don't care whether it's your favorite plant, it could become your favorite plant if it grows well. There's nothing worse than, you know, having the disappointment of you bought this lovely thing that looked great in the garden center, you got it home, you planted it, and you watch this thing languish along for a little while, and then slowly it, you know, disappears. The first thing I think you always want to look at is the soils.
Sure.
Is it appropriate for the types of plants that you're trying to grow? Then the second thing we look at is the environment itself. Is it sunny? Is it shady? You know, what are you trying to accomplish here? And select plants that will do well under those conditions. And they don't have to be native. You know, this is where, sorry, they don't have to be native. But as long as they actually work well, and when we start kind of combining native plants with being green and doing something that's right for the environment, I think that's one of the biggest steps, is putting things in that are already appropriate for your site, rather than trying to totally manipulate that site, whether through an enormous quantity of farm soils, like, for example, the sod lawn that's growing out in the sand dunes. Can it be done with enough water and enough heavy farm soil? Anything can be accomplished. Sure, it can be. But you know what? You're creating a situation that's not sustainable on its own. You're always going to constantly have to be putting additional nutrients, additional water, and other things into that system to make it work. So what we do is we look at, you know, the environment. Is this thing going to be appropriate for the environment? And out here, our environment isn't just, will it get enough water? Will it get enough light? Will it get enough air? We have to consider wildlife. And I think probably the biggest thing is the deer, but they're not the only thing that you can have trouble with. I mean, you can have trouble with squirrels, your neighbor's dog. I have a photo in there of, I had a pig at one time, and the pig-made deer look like
they'll rip up the ground.
Look like nothing.
Yeah.
So these are all things that you really need to consider when you get ready to do anything. And nowadays, people are looking very carefully at the costs, the long-term costs, the long-term maintenance input that they have to put into their properties. And in some cases, putting things back into a wild state may be a bit more expensive on the initial side. But on the long term, there's a couple things that happen. One, you're going to reduce the amount of overall maintenance that you're going to need. Two, you're going to provide habitat for some of the things, the very things that we're trying to keep around, like our songbirds and butterflies and things like that. And three, I just like, to me, there's a huge disconnect with a lot of our landscapes and the surrounding environment, especially when you see a property that abuts up to a natural area. And the first step in the landscaping of that property is to hedge it out with something
California
like
privet.
with California privet or arborvitaes or something that is totally inconsistent with the scene. And a lot of times you meet with the people, and the reason I always ask, why'd you buy this place?
That's what they can find at their local nurseries.
What did you buy?
Typically.
What made you buy this place? Oh, I just love the view of this, or I love the view of that. Well, after you've hemmed the whole property in with your arborvitaes and privet and that, a few years goes by and these things grow. Sooner or later you turn around and you say, well, geez, I can't see the water anymore. I can't see that bit of wild. And to me, I would prefer on my own property, because I can't afford the big, piece, is to kind of incorporate myself into that. So everything looks like it's part of something. And, if we all did that to a certain extent, I think there'd be a certain continuity to our landscapes.
People can go into an area that they love, a beautiful area, and take some pictures of what they see and bring that to a horticulturist or a place like yours and say, oh, I love this plant. What is this? And that's another way that they can bring native
and we do.
species
A lot
in.
of people do that. Unfortunately, sometimes somebody brings me something and it's what they're enamored with is, I don't know how many pictures of Rosa multiflora I look at every year. And people, do you have this plant? Well, gee, I don't. It's a really invasive plant. And it's one of that happens to be one of those plants. It's got about a 3-day period that it looks absolutely fantastic, and that's what keeps you from cutting it down for the rest of the year.
Can you just talk about what an invasive plant is in case people don't know what
An
that
invasive
means?
plant is a plant that's not natural to that particular area and has demonstrated a very aggressive habit to the point that it displaces other plants that may be more appropriate for the area, but most importantly, providing a food source or providing some benefits to the environment other than its presence.
And they take over and native species.
Purple loosestrife, Rosa multiflora. Fortunately, it's interesting. 10 years ago, nobody cared anything about invasive plants. Nowadays, even the nursery people seem to be very conscious
of what they're selling.
Of what they're selling, because there is that clientele backlash. Like every year, there are people that will see something in my garden center and call me on it and say, hey, do you know that plant has turned out to be a real problem somewhere else? And you learn. Yeah, sure. And in the case of natives, there's a lot of non-native plants that are invasive that our natives can do the same things. An example that I use all the time, if I get one request for burning bush a year, I get 200. Blueberries, they come in low bush blueberries, they come in high bush blueberries.